Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming back with me here to the poetry. Escalates make me really nervous. Okay, we're okay. We're good. So I'm really happy to introduce our two featured readers of the evening. So I'm going to start with David Day, our Poetic Opener. David Day has published over 50 books that have sold in excess of 3 million copies and been translated into 20 languages. Best known internationally for his dozen best-selling books on the works of JRR Tolkien, David Day is also noted for 6 major books of natural history and environmental activism. His Doomsday Book of Animals was selected as a Book of the Year by Time magazine and was the basis for 100-part TV series Lost Animals of the 20th Century. David Day has also written 6 illustrated books of animal stories and 3 illustrated books of poems for children. His children's novel, The Emperor's Panda, was nominated for both the Governor General's Award and the National Library Award. His 6 books of poetry for adults, good Lord, David.
Making us look bad.
Seriously. Include poems that have won CBC and National Magazine awards. So very excited to have David come up here. Take it away, David.
It's great to be reading with Susan. We've known each other forever, and she was kind enough to do a review of my first book of poems when I worked in logging camps in the Cowichan Valley, and it was a favorable review. You may wonder why there's a picture of me with a giant egg in the publicity, and the reason is that it belongs to a bird called the elephant bird became extinct shortly after the dodo became extinct, and it's the largest size an egg can possibly get, because if it was any thicker, nothing could get out of the egg. And it's I think it was sort of 17 liters of egg in there. Makes a big almond. But I wrote a book called Nevermore, a Book of Hours, and it's meditations on extinction. And for each of the animals that are in this, I wrote an epitaph, really. And I'll read this one. I was asked to read, called Cry of the Curlew, and it's the Eskimo curlew. I'll read just 3 poems. This is the first one. Eskimo curlew became extinct in 1985. Knud Rasmussen, among the Inuit, claimed the word for poem was inertsa, meaning a breath. Neither speech nor song, but fixed musical diction, a flow of beautiful, smooth words recited in a low voice, delivered at a moderate pace, a crystalline form of natural language that must be worked and shaped as smoothly and carefully as soapstone. Word images and word charms, polished like walrus ivory. Old pieces are learned from the elders. They are passed round and admired like fine carvings or well-made weapons. But do not use them too often. Do not wear them out. These charms were made for protection against disease, against the evil effects of shooting stars, of cunning foes, of envy. When death occurs, strict mourning taboos are observed. But when the taboo is lifted, the bereaved ones use these charms, murmuring them each to the other and each to those now gone. Rasmussen also records another Inuit word for poem, tagladia, meaning to name. There have been 40 common names for the Eskimo curlew. One Inuit name means swift wing. A Cree meant sweet grass. An Abenaki name meant beaked one. Many other names in imitation of their various cries. Among the Inuit, they were called Pipioka, Tura Akapiknika. To the Cree, Wiki Manarusu, Wiki Minu, Wiki Wanaso. This recitation of their many names links them together like prayer beads on a rosary, grants the passage of their many souls across that other world's continent. In and out ports of Labrador, they are called the Gallagher birds and the Clou among the Quebecois. They were known as Corbeaux de Eskimo, while the farmers of Ontario called them little sicklebills. Market hunters named them doughbirds, and foots in New Zealand and New England and New York, and prairie pigeons in the American West. The islanders of the Caribbean greeted them as wood snipe, chittering and shivering curlew, while the Latinos of Venezuela and Colombia, they were known as Zaparino Esquimal. In Uruguay, Cola Orlar, and Cola Campino in the Pampas of the Argentine. So this poem is my word charm, smooth and polished as I can make it. Let us hear your names again: Little Sicklebill, Sweetgrass, Swiftwing, and your voice carried like your wings on the north wind. Pipiuka, Tura Tura, Wiki Manasu, Wiki Mananu, Wiki Manasu.
Wow.
And a very different thing, this is a book called Gothic. It's illustrated by Alan Lee, who did the Lord of the Rings films, but we met years before that. And I lived near the Highgate Cemetery in England, and it's the creepiest cemetery in the world. And we just done a book called Castles, and I decided you didn't get to own a castle by being a nice guy. So these are Gothic poems, and everybody, pretty well everybody in it is a terrible person. It's called The Door. It is always unexpected. It comes unannounced, unsummoned. Once in a lonely street in Florence, where a red light pulsed in the night. Another time in a crowded London room, I have no name for it. Oriental, aromatic, sweet with a burning edge. Impossible to describe. It comes from years ago. It's the scent of you when we were lovers. It stops me suddenly, an immovable mountain of pain. But as I breathe, the mountain walls crack. A stone door opens darkly, door that for other times is shut like the lid of a lead coffin in a crypt. Once again, the long, dark cave of wanting you. It glitters with gems and eyes and knives. Why do you haunt me still after all these years? Unwinding the winding sheets, the obscene striptease. Come no nearer. I do not wish to see what was done. I tell you again, I had no choice, and they promised me you would not suffer long. Come no nearer. If we touch, the door will fall, and together we shall remain forever trapped within the mountain of pain.
Wow. Wow.
This one I thought Susan might appreciate because it's a flashback to the 70s and 60s. is from a book called Just Say No to Family Values. And it's definitely not PC. It's called Time Warp in the Aegean. I lived in Greece for a number of years. Well, you really had to be there to understand. The school was set up in Greece in the 60s as an alternative American arts college. I arrived in 1973. It was a freestyle sort of time and space, Woodstock colliding with Rocky Horror. Something strange was in the air in America. Nixon was on the skids and youth was in revolt. Even the seeming remoteness of the Aegean Islands, you could feel it. There were student riots in Athens, and the mindless dictatorship of Greek colonels collapsed in a colossal heap of tin pots. So we all felt we had a job to do. I mean, the whole point of an alternative school was to get these college kids out of a small town American view of the world. When they arrived, most of them were so American pie and squeaky clean. I don't know, I suppose I thought God or Karl Marx had sent me on a mission to save them from Richard Nixon. So he gave the whole class LSD, interjects Don. You didn't really give them acid, did you? She's arching one of her eyebrows at me. Yes, he did, retorts Don. He said, you all need something to write about. Here, take one of these and come back in a couple of days. Well, that's sort of simplifying. I mumbled defensively. Then 2 months later, he got arrested in Athens for kidnapping. Cheerfully. Let's not go on to that again, I complained. Kidnapping, who did you kidnap? She seemed slightly alarmed. Oh, forget kidnapping, will you? I snapped impatiently. It's not a big deal. Besides, they dropped the charges anyway. I can see she's reluctant to let me off. Okay, but what's this about giving your students acid? Look, I had bad role models. What can I say? In 1969, I spent a long summer weekend with Ken Kesey, the pranksters, and a swarm of Hell's Angels. We were doing variations on the electric Kool-Aid acid test, drinking shot glasses of tequila and LSD. Sometime later, somebody called Zodiac sandwiched between two coffin-sized amps and played the Grateful Dead straight through me, full blast. It took me 3 days to stop vibrating. Attitudes towards learning were different then. I felt I had a fairly well-rounded education for the time. For 10 years, I divided my life between a dozen logging camps and a slightly smaller number of universities. I listened to Allen Ginsberg chanting a lot of poems and helped out at the first Greenpeace riot under the Peace Arch. I went to a lot of rock concerts and took off all my clothes. I read with Ferlinghetti at an anti-Trident rally. I believed in free love, but didn't get to practice it half as much as I assumed everybody else did. At the university, a lot of people seemed to be running off with other people's wives, husbands, and daughters. A lot of babysitters became mistresses or mothers. Eventually, most of my professors abandoned academic life and with a number of students and disciples migrated to the Yukon. After consulting the I Ching, they all decided to live together in communes where they practiced yoga, astral traveling, polygamy, polyandry, and baked a lot of excellent bread. Acid was a communion wafer at the time. Let's just say that with LSD, we all partied to some kind of divine secret. Ask any musician of the time, and he'll tell you, behind every great song, there's a great pill.
Oh.
Great songs by Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and the Doors, all dead from drugs, interjects Don. Come on, lighten up, I suggest. Look, my friend Sean taught at a perfectly respectable university, this one. At a perfectly respectable university, he organized a student poetry reading in a Roman Catholic convent. It incorporated psychedelic sound and light show with the marijuana smoke, nude dancing, satanic rites, and ritual slaughter of a virgin on the convent altar. Such was the spirit of the times. The nuns applauded the loudest. It all seems bloody irresponsible to me, she says huffily. You could have wrecked those kids' lives. Do you know what happened to them? I go quiet for a while. Actually, I do know what happened to them. And it's quite disturbing. I'm not sure I want to know, she replies with a shudder. They all became lawyers and doctors and bankers and teachers. It's like pillars of society, every one of them. Nice people too. Thank God, she sighs. To tell the truth, I'm profoundly depressed. What's eating you, she asks. She's arched her eyebrows again. I can hardly stand to think of it. God damn it. I guess Nixon got them after all.
Okay, wow, thanks, David. That sounded very loud to me. Okay, so the moment has come. I get to welcome our wonderful featured reader. And I want to say again a big thank you to our very generous donor who is not being named, who has brought Susan to us tonight. So thank you very much to our poet sponsor for the evening. Susan Musgrave has published more than 30 books and is now shortlisted for the 2023 Griffin Poetry Prize. Woo! Also in 2023, she became the 30th recipient of the George Woodcock Lifetime Achievement Award. The high point of her literary career was finding her name in the Index of Montreal's Irish Mafia. Please welcome Susan Musgrave.
Thank you so much. And what a wonderful open mic. Open mic, the last one I went to, was a bit of a disaster. And the first poet got up and said, my poem is called Silence. And he stood totally quiet for 5 minutes. It was like a mockumentary. And then the next woman read about her mastectomy in graphic detail. And the third person put on a fake Japanese accent, like, oh, soul. And it was like, oh my God, what planet have I thought I'll never, ever. My husband used to say if I died first, he was going to have an open mic at my funeral. He didn't. I mean, I didn't. He did. So it was anyway. But after tonight, I changed my mind. Those were some fabulous poems. Really, thank you so much, and thank you, David, too. I should have been the opener for David. He's been around, well, as long as I have, actually. But about the same. Been in more logging camps, though. My book that's shortlisted for this prize is called Exculpatory Lilies. A lot of people can't pronounce exculpatory, especially poets. They say that lily book you have. It means exonerated from guilt, as many of you probably know. The title comes from a New Yorker cartoon, a woman opening a bouquet of flowers, saying to her husband, it's been ages since you brought me exculpatory lilies. And I thought, I've always wanted to have a poem called that. So I wrote one, and this is the title poem. Good Friday, the day they delivered that sad bouquet, was the day our cat ran out on the road and failed to look both ways. I'd stashed the candy eggs under the sink in their pink raffia nests, safe amongst the household poisons where the kids had been warned not to go. On Easter Sunday before first light, I stole outside to hide the loot. The family of bunnies in gold foil, the high-quality chocolate you insisted on buying. Nothing's too good for my girls. The lilies, smacking of humility, devotion, had been for me. Your way of saying, I'm sorry, I can stop. I will lose the needle and spoon today. But I was finished, I was through, said, sorry had been your default setting since the day we vowed I do. I think now I was cruel. The cat darted out, hit the car, staggered back as far as our front gate. For a second, I thought she might have been stunned, nothing more, though the dribble of blood at the corners of her mouth was a small grief with a life of its own. I buried her at the bottom of the garden, where I had tossed your exculpatory lilies, and where I picture them still. Each new day above ground is a hard miracle, you wrote. I hung on every miraculous breath you took as I stood outside your door at night, dying to hear you breathe. In the end, it wasn't me you turned to, but God. Wasn't love meant to be more pure than faith, more sacred and enduring? These days I lean heavy into the wind, and the wind's blowing hard. God turns up in a lot of poems in this book, which is odd because I have no concept of God. They say in AA and Al-Anon, the God of your understanding. And I have some fabulous friends who are ministers, and I just talk to them. They're so amazing. They could convert me if they wanted to. I met JRR, who is the prison chaplain in Vancouver 2 days ago, and we talked for 2 hours, and it was so interesting. So I think I grew up with that idea of God, like William Blake's God, the man with the beard and who disapproved of us. And I felt always disapproved of, especially by God. But anyway, this a poem that's prefaced with a graffiti I saw in Vancouver, God loves a drug dealer. There's a section in this book called The Goodness of This World that are all poems from my daughter, Sophie, who died in 2021. It was a year and a half ago of an overdose of fentanyl and benzos. And I talk about that because there's such a stigma still, but every day I meet somebody who's got a relative who's struggling. They've lost children, they've lost parents. It's such to put faces to the names of this, whatever this opioid crisis is, I suppose what we're trying to do. There are people behind these horrendous events. So anyway, this is about Sophie. She forced you to cut your hair, hack it off in front of those you counted as friends, but failed you in the end. Next time she'd make you shave your eyebrows too, she said, and sent you back onto the street with what was left of your dignity. This girl sells the heroin you can't live without. She said she would donate your hair to a good cause like cancer, and I thought, trust you to find a drug dealer with a social conscience. I have learned not to ask why, but then I opened the door and saw you standing small in your nakedness, the kind of nakedness that can never again be clothed. I cried and cradled your head, while you, wise as ever, said, Mom, it will grow back. It's only hair. But your hurt goes deep. You were the child I suffered for, your long hair streaming as you ran wild into the wind with your imaginary friends. While other mothers snipped price tags off back-to-school fashions, I sat by your bed in the intensive care unit, watching your vital signs blip across a screen. You were barely 14. You'd had enough of being alive. I lifted your head from the pillow. The summer sun had streaked your hair faintly gold and brushed thin strands from your face. I could almost feel you want to live again by the grace as your hair slipped through my hands. I used to take my daughter, Charlotte, my oldest daughter, to poetry readings, which she called poultry readings, which I was like, I think she's here tonight. She hasn't been to a reading of mine since she was about 6, because she would sit at my feet, shake her head, Mom, that's a lie. Didn't happen. And of course, poetry, you take a germ of truth and then you weave a poem around it. And there's a line in a film, I lie the truth. I mean, you get to the truth through lies sometimes. So, but she's welcome to do that again. I don't mind if she says.
Already a liar.
What? Be quiet or you don't get your allowance. This is 40 years later, or 40, 10, a long time. Anyway, this is a poem called Wind Through Trees. And my granddaughters are mentioned, and they may think this is a lie, but again, there's truth in it. We live in a house, or my daughter and granddaughters now do, called the Tree House out in Pat Bay, and that was built by what's all in the poem, a poet, and around a huge Douglas fir tree that's I think 900 years old. And in the storms, you can watch the walls parting and the ceiling parting, and so it's very much a live house. My granddaughter calls the tree that grows through the heart of our house a Douglas fern tree. I've told her how a poet, Ernest Fern, built the house around this tree almost a century ago, insulated the walls with newspapers, too soaked in rat urine now for us to save, including one from 1932, whose headline reads, Mad Trapper of Rat River Killed in Dramatic Shootout. He'd been an outlaw most of his life, the way you were before I brought you home. Ferns, rats, and outside on the piece of earth we say with certainty is land we own, wind through trees. So I'm staying at my brother's house. My brother is here too, but he doesn't tell me that my poems are lies. He's very sweet and kind. But he still lives in the house. Well, he built a house for my mother down below, and she lived there until she died, I guess the year after Stephen, 2019. But this morning I went to pick lilac, the same lilac bush that grew there when I was a kid. So it's 60, 70 years old, or older, because it was the previous owner, who was from Ireland, had planted it. So I was picking some, but as I turned the corner, I thought, I wonder if I'll see Mum's ghost. And as I did, a woman came out of, and I didn't know who she was. She had a mask on. She just looked at me and she didn't say anything. And I said, oh, I think she thought I was trespassing. She didn't realize that I was related to my brother. And I said, who are you? And she said, I'm Judith. That was my mother's name. So I said, well, I'm Susan. And she said, oh, I just love your brother. That's why I come back here. And anyway, so she said, well, it was odd. She said, do you think your mother's ghost is here? And I said, I don't know. She said, well, last night a book fell out of the bookshelf just onto the floor. I said, which one was it? Because, this would tell me something. It was a book about how to scare away deer. So this poem, see, it seemed, I love the way the synchronicity happens. When you have a poem and you go, that's what happened today, this poem. So this is called Tending Small Flowers in Spring. My mother, 90 this spring, is fed up with the deer raiding her garden. It hurts too much, she says, to try and scare them away. It hurts to be alive, to have to move your limbs, to bend down and pull the weeds. She can no longer kneel, and when she falls, she can't get up again. I've known my mother longer than I've known anyone. She can still get around well enough to leave a vase of small flowers, the blue vase we bought on our last trip to Ireland, in the guest room when I come home to stay. She picks last year's pearly everlastings, what she calls deadery, so tough even the deer have forsaken them, that thrive for no reason in the riot of weeds. Yeah, that was great, Judith. And this is a poem about my grandparents. One of the things you have to do as a Griffin shortlisted poet is fill in ridiculous answers to questions that are actually really not very intelligent. I hate to say, I don't know where they come from. One question I've been asked is, why are there poems about your parents and your children and your grandparents in this book? My answer is going to be, I didn't know there were. Really? Please. I don't know who makes these questions. This is for the CBC too. Anyway, my grandfather, his dying words were in Latin, of course, sunt lacrimae rerum, which he would translate as all things are weeping. But when I read it, I looked up translation, and tears of things is what seems to be the most common. So that's what I call the poem. And it's a poem set in Vancouver, which is unusual. I don't think I've any poem set in Vancouver, but this one, because I used to go and stay with them in the summers up in Point Grey. My grandfather spoke Latin at the breakfast table over his all bran and 2 stewed prunes. Read Parry Match in the Loo, referred to his many grandchildren as little cannon fodder. What else do I remember of my childhood summers? Raspberry canes, sweet peas the length of the garden fence, the English oaks my grandfather had planted from the acorns he brought with him when he emigrated after the First World War. Learning to sew painstakingly, play tennis desperately at Jericho Beach, the air sauced with heat, the fierce walk home uphill all the way to Trimble and 13th. Shelling peas on the back porch, the satisfying ping as each pea bounced off the sides of the stainless steel bowl. The potatoes my grandfather planted in the boulevard, the humbugs he kept in a jar on the mantle above the rows of Penguin Classics with their intelligent orange spines. How I desired beyond all reason those unreachable sweets, and how my grandfather, possessed of the ability to read my mind, offered me one every evening after supper. African violets on the windowsill, the scent of rose geraniums. the rock cakes my grandmother made using bacon fat before it was considered unhealthy, and tomato sandwiches on thin slices of the solid white bread my grandfather baked every Saturday. Salt, freshly ground pepper, a smear of butter, mayonnaise we couldn't afford at home. We took tea on the juggernaut, what my grandfather called the well-braced garden bench he'd built himself in the basement, where the shelves were lined with my grandmother's preserves, peaches like wedges of wet sunlight, bletted medlars and quince, gibbous moons of pears. Everything my grandfather built was well-braced, the measure of a good carpenter, I observed. In winter, when I visited, I was awakened each day by the sound of my grandfather shoveling coal in the basement to feed the furnace, a sound I found comforting because I could count on it. Wading through spring snow on the UBC endowment lands in search of his sapling oaks, home through the woods above 16th Avenue, where he would stop, ignoring my impatience, to whisper, "Hark at the bird." You cherish them, then they are gone. What more can be said? My grandfather's dying words were "Sunt lacrimae rerum." My grandmother's, "What is going to become of me?" This is a poem that's kind of for Leonard Cohen, but it's also for Gordon Lightfoot. And because he died recently, I'm feeling a bit guilty because I was supposed to write a poem for his 70th birthday for an anthology. So I took the poem I'd written for Leonard Cohen and put Gordon Lightfoot's name in there. But then when I put it in the book, I changed it back to Leonard Cohen. And so, unfortunately, he died just as my book came out. Well, Leonard Cohen's already dead, of course, but the poem is called Humility. If I had to be the underwear of somebody famous, I would choose Leonard Cohen to wear me. I would want to be blue because blue's a color you can feel. And how do you think I would feel being intimately associated with Leonard and his private, oh, this could so easily become a confessional poem, which it was never meant to be. I would want to be schmalt, redder and deeper than azurite blue, more like the dusky purple I tried painting the bedroom one smoldering evening when the sun was going down and my lover had left town and Leonard was on the front lawn wearing nothing but me. And this is my favorite poem in the book. It's called The Truth, and it's I tend to be one of those annoying know-it-all people who knows everything. But like I'm always right, and my friends hate me for that. Like Patrick Lane used to say, no, he'd argue, and then he'd find out later. He'd look online and find out I was right. I don't like that about myself because who wants to be right all the time? I'm sure I've been wrong once or twice, but so this is a poem about me, that part of me. The hitchhiker I picked up a mile outside of Masset claimed he'd been enlightened by buttercups, so many that to stare at them too hard would have induced blindness. All day he had meditated by the ditch, and the moment I'd pulled over in my Jeep Cherokee, he knew he'd been blessed. He'd been waiting his whole life for someone like me. It crossed my mind to tell him those were dandelions, not buttercups. But how pleased I am with myself, I refrained. So I can do it. And now I just think, really, what's the difference? Why do I have to correct somebody if there's their pronunciation or their spelling? I don't. You know, it's like, I guess because I was corrected my whole life by my father. So you pick up what you're given as a child, you carry into adulthood. In fact, I have a poem about this somewhere. These are lives like train. Just a couple more because you've had a long evening. But this is called He Runs Our Lives Like Trains. I have a phobia about being late because I was once late home from school and basically my parents thought, you know, I'd been kidnapped and that was it. And so for years afterwards, I'd say, don't worry about me if I'm late. And if I'm supposed to meet someone at 12 and I get there at 2 minutes past, I assume they've come and gone, you know, I'm late. So it's a bit of a neuroses. Okay, once, the one time in my life, I arrived home late from school because I had taken the long way back along the tracks. I found my mother in bed, grief stitching together her lips, in mourning for the loss she had feared since the day I was pushed from her tear-shaped womb. My father, who'd never touched a broom in the long history of their married life, had swept the house clean and started on the garage. In his mind, I believe he was sweeping away all traces of me so that they might live. Last thing at night, or at first light, when I wake to the birds shrieking on the river, I hear my father's voice over the swish, swish, swish of the switch. You were late. We thought we'd never see you again. Safe at home in his world, so broken and so whole in the same moment. This was my life.
Oh, wow.
And finally, I live on this beautiful river, the Sangan River on Haida Gwaii. I spend a lot of time staring at the river because I read a Chinese proverb: if you sit staring at the river long enough, the bodies of your enemies will float past. Don't know, I haven't seen any yet. I keep waiting. Maybe I don't have any, I'm thinking. Where is the poem? Oh yeah. So, and I have an aspiring Buddhist practice. I say aspiring because I don't think I could ever fully never be a Buddhist, but I really admire the thoughts behind, or the lack of thought, put it that way. But I had a Buddhist teacher and we were sitting in her studio and I said, oh, there's a heron. And she said, right now, that's just a thought. And what does she mean? I thought, then I realized as soon as you name something, you separate from it. That's what the whole thing about being one with everything is, which I fail at, because as writers, that's what we do. We name things and pin them down. So it's the opposite of being a Buddhist. So it's really hard to be an aspiring Buddhist and a poet. Anyway, one can try. So this poem is called More Than Seeing. It's the last poem I'll read. And it's again, something I aspire to. There is a moment before the kingfisher dives, the eagle swoops. The small green ducks disappear like the breeze in the low-hanging cedar branches over the river. There is a moment before I name the kingfisher, the eagle, the ducks, when I am not the observer. I am the dart of light, rush of wings, the trusting wind. I am grace, an end of living in awe of things, a beginning of living with them.
Beautiful.
Thank you.